Greetings. Welcome. Hopefully your interest in electric vehicles will be broadened by this 170-year history describing all their winning and sometimes not so winning forms. Our narrative begins with a scientific breakthrough in 1821 in England, followed by the first electric vehicles in Scotland in the 1830s, then traces the several successes and setbacks that became the stepping stones to their current resurgence starting in the year 2000. Our historical journey is told in just 3 chapters. Early scientific breakthroughs at the hands of internationally renowned inventors created a variety of transportation rigs with widely varying impacts and import. A progression of rises led to a series of falls that eventually created an EV legacy with environmental implications that are still unfolding today. And nostalgically, along the way, horse-drawns receded into the mists of history. The first man standing tall in our story is Michael Faraday, discoverer of benzene, inventor of the Bunsen burner, and most importantly, the first known electromagnetic rotating device. This is a mock-up of his experiment with a magnetic field in which a wire could be made to rotate in a pool of mercury. He powered the field using a variation of the voltaic pile, the world's first storage battery invented by Volta, an Italian chemist, in 1800. With copper and silver coins amid layers of brine-soaked cardboard and pieces of zinc, the pile generated modest amounts of DC electricity. Later, Faraday described the foundational relationship between a magnetic field and an electrical circuit, his law of induction. Let's begin our parade of vehicles with 2 Scotsmen using non-rechargeable voltaic batteries to power the first EVs in the 1830s. More for show than practicality, trips were measured in meters versus kilometers, until 2 Frenchmen invented and improved the rechargeable lead-acid battery, soon to play a major role in the development of the first EVs. Meanwhile, steam came to cars, a natural progression from its use in factories, trains, and streetcars. Initial popularity led to the first presidential limo being a steamer. However, long startup times and frequent fuel fill-ups eventually undercut success, so steamers soon passed into obscurity. At the same time, internal combustion engines proliferated thanks to a Hall of Fame list of inventors. IC engines were developed in a number of configurations, powered by an interesting variety of fuels. Britisher Edward Butler deserves special mention since he is credited with developing the first gasoline ICE and several other familiar components that make cars go. But here Benz is the superstar of this famous collection of brilliant minds and skilled hands. His ICE was a real beauty and it powered the first patented, hence practical, vehicle of its day. Three-wheeled rigs called trikes or dog carts were common during this time. Notice, amongst the specs, it had electric ignition. During this period, the man called the father of the electric mobility movement, Nikola Tesla, note the S sounds as a Z, was on the scene. He was the inventor of alternating current and the AC induction motor found in many EVs today. During his lifetime, he filed over 300 patents, fluorescent and neon bulbs among them, but many more of his ideas were hijacked, like those purloined by Marconi for his radio invention. But Tesla's role in the War of the Currents is most worthy of mention here. In 1893, a decades-long struggle between Thomas Edison and Tesla is set to enter its last round. So, let me set the scene. We're at the Chicago World's Exposition, and a serial killer is on the loose in the White City. But that's a side story. There are 14 huge pavilions on exhibition. George Ferris is showing off his 250-foot diameter wheel for the first time. Brownies make their debut thanks to Bertha Palmer's recipe, along with Hershey's chocolate, the hamburger, Pabst Blue Ribbon beer, juicy fruit gum, and the zipper. The automatic dishwasher is also a headliner, making a big splash, pun intended. Tesla, backed by George Westinghouse's locomotive air brake money, wins by half the bidding war for powering the entire 200-building complex versus Edison's direct current system funded by J.P. Morgan's big bank bucks. Thank goodness Tesla prevailed, because it's safe to say, if his AC wasn't subsequently developed as an alternative to Edison's DC, there would be power plants everywhere, and most of today's common wiring would be nearly the gauge of the fat end of a baseball bat. Now, back to the EV side of our story. Rechargeable batteries come to cars. Thomas Parker produced a dozen of his practicals starting in 1884. He is also noted as the key figure responsible for electrifying the London Underground. William Morrison gave us the first American EV. For its day, it had real range and speed. Wow, 20 miles per hour, while lugging nearly 800 pounds of batteries. This is an ad for a family of topless electric carriages, looking more like Conestogas without their stogas up top. This ad says ladies can learn to drive one in 20 minutes. In fact, women took to electrics so much that a stigma arose to the point where some makers attached faux radiators to the car fronts to mask their true identity. Bakers were easy on the ears and the nose and easy to start. This is a longish read of some interesting EV firsts. Next up, early hybrids. Here, Ferdinand Porsche is at the wheel. An electrical generator drove up to 4 motors, and then a Daimler engine took over from there. A time later, Woods Motors had the first single-motor hybrid. As a result of all this rising innovation, By the 1880s, horse-drawns were starting to wane. For time remembered, they had offered their own unique means of transport, from the conventional, through the offbeat, to the gorgeous. They were pretty complex little rigs in their own right, here shown in nearly 50 principal parts. Buggies guaranteed exposure to the elements, an uncomfortable ride on what passed for roads in the 1800s, and a long-term view of the back end of a beast that recklessly dispensed emissions at will and whim. In their day, there was no such thing as range anxiety, since the fuel, in the form of hay, up to 25 pounds, and water, 15 gallons, a horse consumed daily, was generally cheap and in plentiful supply. But all that processed fuel has to go someplace. So this is about a major city's ground and air contamination problem in the form of solids and liquids in amazing quantities for a typical year in the 1890s. While you are digesting these numbers, swarming overhead or on the ground are hordes of beyond quantification. Oh, the joys of being a sanitation worker in the big city. So down with the pollution and up with this slick publication that announced the arrival of a new age. Despite a sales ratio favoring EVs, and there being over 100 EV manufacturers, by the turn of the century, electrics were about to fade away too, taking their first fall due to 3 impacts: a car company, a road network, and an oil industry. For 3 decades, Henry Ford's series of gas models dominated the auto industry. With Model A's as bookends of an era. But the star of the lineup was his 20th lettered attempt, the 1908 Model T. Henry brought affordability to the masses. But windshields and headlights were extras. The key to his success was mastering the moving assembly line. Mr. Ford's Tin Lizzie matured over the years, incorporating many innovations. Among the most notable, the electric starter broke through big time on the T. No more bruised or broken knuckles, hands, or forearms. Glued-on solid rubber tires were replaced by smoother riding, removable pneumatics thanks to John Dunlop and the Michelin brothers. ICE improvements brought speed by way of more horsepower. And Ford also standardized left-hand drive, allowing the ladies to step out on the curb side of the car instead of the muddy middle of the road. And to round out the picture, some more amazing numbers. Production levels for the 1914 T versus 299 other car makers. Ford turned out 5 times more cars with 95% fewer employees. The second significant impact on EVs was a rise in road touring leading to a dramatic expansion of the national highway system in the 20s as part of the Good Roads movement, inspired initially by bicyclists. Range anxiety became a cloud over EVs. The third nail in the EV coffin was the abundance of crude oil, such that gasoline became cheaper than water, thanks to large reserves discovered in the western states in the 30s. Gas stations popped up across the country. A Pittsburgh Gulf was the first. ICE car makers became plentiful, and by 1935, electrics all but disappeared. This marks EV's first fall. Jumping forward about 30 years, we find a brief EV comeback. Gas prices soared due to shortages caused by oil embargoes, creating long waits in gas lines. NASA raised the possibilities of EVs when its lunar rover explored the moon. The car industry took some notice and offered a small selection of alternative fuel vehicles, but they generated little consumer interest, probably due to being generally smallish, ungainly, and ugly without much range. So much for fall number 2. Fast forward to the 90s, when concerns like greenhouse emissions, ozone depletion, and foreign oil dependency became common, and significant federal interest kick-started renewed interest in EVs. GM tried out its first emissions-free concept electric. California announced the first zero emissions mandate, a big-time jolt to the auto industry, especially when 14 other states subsequently embraced the mandate. Gas vehicles had to achieve mileage standards in certain timeframes to avoid heavy fines. Car makers began converting popular models into EVs, commonly called compliance cars, achieving speeds and performance levels much like ICEs. Most notable of this era was GM's EV1, fated for a cultish splash and premature demise. Certainly more attractive than any of the alternative fuel vehicles of the 60s. It had decent range and excellent acceleration, but lease only. It was the first EV to run on lithium-ion batteries, just shortly before production was abruptly ended in 1999. What followed were court appeals, candlelight vigils, and repossession horror stories. Some drivers were unable to get their cars back after dropping them off for service. Essentially, the entire fleet was crushed. At a secret location in Arizona, Mesa, only a few museum pieces remain. So who killed the EV1 and why? In a nutshell, under pressure from Big Auto and Big Oil, California relaxed its zero emissions rules because GM found the car much too costly to produce, along with disappointing revenue returns on service and repairs. And the oil industry just didn't dig electrics for obvious reasons. Story over. That was fall number 3. So inspired by a significant environmental impetus, the start of this century heralds EV's rise, or comeback number 4, marked with a bow wave of new arrivals. Japanese hybrids were first to come ashore. The first long-range all-battery electric was launched. The federal government started to fund thousands of charging stations nationwide. Affordable cars appeared. And now, dozens of choices are available in all 3 electrified versions. So, that concludes our history segment. If you haven't already, you are encouraged to view the presentation on the return of the EV, covering hardware and a take on the present and future of driving electric. Thanks for being interested. May the amps keep you on the move. Cheers.